Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm not going to grade you on this, but how many people in this room have read a page of this book, at least? All right, good. So, great. You won't know how it ends. I can So, 30 years ago, I was sitting where you are, studying business. I assume most of you are studying business, right? A lot of you. And wondering what on earth I was going to do with this degree that I had when I left. And so when I graduated, I went and worked for a company. And then I went and worked for another company. And then 10 years out of school, I joined an extraordinary organization called the International Forum. And this work, now bear with me with technology. Can you see all those pictures? Yeah? Okay. Oh gosh, you guys are so quiet. Well, not very well, but anyways, I'll give you a collage. So this company actually designed traveling learning experiences for the CEOs of global companies, and a third of them came from North America, a third from Europe, and a third from Asia. So it was a very diverse group. At any point in time, we'd take 20 people into a country and do sort of a deep dive into what was happening in that country. So they'd learn about the business systems, they'd learn about what was happening in government, what was happening in healthcare, education, and the intent was really to help them see the world in a much broader context than just what their business experience would allow them to see it. And it was immensely rewarding, both obviously for them and for me. Part of my job while I was there was to go out into the world and find people for them to meet with. And so I met people in all walks of life. And as Christy mentioned, during that process, I met some extraordinary people who, frankly, no one had ever heard of. They were not famous for what they had done. There was nothing written on them. There were no movies about them. But they were solving problems in their societies that governments and well-funded aid organizations and experts had been challenged by for decades. And many of the problems were still unsolved. And yet, here were these individuals that really no one had ever heard of. They were no one spectacular. They were just everyday people who had somehow, in the context of a community, been able to make things better. And the title of the book that actually kind of encompassed all of it, and they're just a series of stories about the people that I met, is really about how one person's effort can change a life, empower a community. It really is misleading because it really wasn't about one person. It was really about the communities that they developed. Anyways, it was very interesting, and it wasn't really until I met this group of people that I really understood, ironically, the value of my business education. That it wasn't really to get a job, but it was actually a way of thinking. And it was a way to solve problems. It was a way to see opportunity. It was a way to bring together resources, build connections, and make something happen. And most importantly, it was a discipline that made me understand who a customer was and how important a customer is in the whole business relationship. And ironically, I learned that from people who had nothing to do with business. It was these extraordinary individuals. And so in 2008, as Christy mentioned, I decided that I would leave my job and actually go back into the world and find some of these people I had met over the previous 10 years and see what I could learn from them. I mean, I think I had a theory on why they had been successful based on my business background. They were great leaders. They knew how to inspire people. They put a plan in place. They motivated their team, right? All those things they must have in order to solve these problems. But I wanted to know more. I wanted to know who they were and what had inspired them to do it and really how had this kind of come about. And what I learned actually really surprised me. It wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be. So to give you a sense of kind of where I went, oh good, technology's working. So the little triangle is where I started, which is Chicago. And I just kind of put this up to give you an idea of the breadth of geography that we covered, or that I covered. So two of the people in the book are in North America and the US. One is in Sweden, a teacher who I won't talk about today, but if you read the book, you'll hear his story. He is a teacher who became a principal of a non-performing school in an immigrant ghetto outside of Stockholm and ended up turning it around. Extraordinary story about a community. And two in India, who I'll talk about today, a man in Thailand and a woman in Tibet. Okay. So the first person I went back to see was a woman named Lily Ye. And Lily had been part of one of our programs in Philadelphia in the late 80s, early 90s. Lily is an artist. She was a professor in the early 80s. She was a professor and a mother and an artist. She had a full-time job, and so she was pretty busy. She had a regular life. She was booming along in her career. She was in her 40s. Oh, connection lost. Technology just failed me. And while she was working, she got a call from a man who ran a dance studio in North Philadelphia. Has anybody here ever been to Philadelphia? Have you ever been to North Philadelphia? Probably not. So North Philadelphia is one of the toughest neighborhoods in the country. So it's riddled with crime, gang fighting, drugs. Every family there has lost a family member for health reasons, to violence, or in wars. And so it's an incredibly fragmented community where people really were staying in their own houses, weren't really hanging out together, there weren't any community organizations. And the only thing that was really kind of a common ground was this dance school. And the man who ran it asked Lily, he called her up one day and said, I've seen your artwork in local galleries. Would you come and build an art park in the vacant lot next to my dance school? And initially, Lily said, no, I don't have any time to do that. And then she changed her mind. And I asked her once, why did you say no in the first place? And she said, well, I said, you must have been afraid to go there. And she said, no, I actually wasn't afraid to go there. She said, I was worried because, I've got a lot going on in my life, and, this seemed like something I really didn't have time to do, and I was worried I couldn't do a good job at it, so initially I said no. But I changed my mind because I am an artist, and all of a sudden I was given an opportunity to help someone through what I know how to do. And I thought, if I didn't do it, the best of me might die, and the rest would amount to nothing. And so she went. She went one summer to Philadelphia, and I'm going to see if I can reconnect my thing here. We'll just wing it. I'll wing it. She went to Philadelphia, and she started in the vacant lot. And this is a picture actually back in the early 80s of her in the vacant lot. And she brought with her bags of cement, and she had this idea of building a garden out of mosaics. So she was going to build trees out of cement and then put shards of ceramics and glass in it and make them pretty, but they would kind of look like trees. And then she would build benches for people to sit on. So she had this whole vision in her head, but she had no one to help her. And then one day she was noticing that the kids in the neighborhood were kind of sneaking out of their houses and sort of watching her, what she was doing. And eventually she turned to them and said, well, you're going to stand there and just watch me? Why don't you help me? So she handed them shovels and she said, start digging holes and start pouring cement. And here, this is what we're doing. And pick up some ceramics and start making mosaics. And before long, the kids were completely engaged in this project in this vacant lot. A few days later, their mothers, wondering, where the heck are my kids, came out and said, oh, what's going on here? And Lily said, well, come on and join us. And so the moms joined. And they all started working on this project, which was slowly emerging to be this beautiful thing. And Lily said one of the things she noticed when they were all working together was that as they were laying their hands on the mosaics and on the trees, the different things they were building, they started to talk about their lives. And they started to talk about the things that scared them. And they started to talk about the things that they were worried about and the things they lost and the family members they lost. And they realized as they did this, it was kind of like they weren't looking at each other. They were working on this project together. They realized as they did this how much they had in common, that they all kind of shared this pain and loss. And through this community project, so to speak, of building this art park, they began to connect with each other. And when the art park was finally done, it looked like this. So you can see the trees. They're on the right-hand side. And in the background is actually a stage where now, this is actually taken today or like a few years ago. They built a mural. That's a mural on the side of the building that was the dance school. And the stage is a place where they perform plays and music now. But what it did for them back then was it created a space for them to come together and talk and do things. And so Lily thought after the first summer and her $2,500 stipend that she got, she was done. She thought she'd probably go back to be a teacher. But when the summer was actually over and she thought about it, she said, no, this was so incredible. She quit her job and she came back to Philadelphia. It's more complicated than that, but essentially that's what she did. And she started to work with the community. And within a period of 25 years, they converted 120 vacant lots. They set up after-school programs on art. They created juice bars. They created small businesses. This was in a 25-year period. They grew gardens in some of the vacant lots, so they filled it with earth, and they started planting plants and selling their produce at farmers markets. And so this neighborhood that had been completely desolate all of a sudden came to life, and people were on the streets, and they were hanging out in the vacant lots. That's actually moms and kids one afternoon when I was there. And it really, it created this community that had really never been there before. And if you go there today, which is how many years later? We're in 2019, it started early 80s, it's still like this. It lasted long after Lily left. So she stayed there for about 20, 25 years and then went on to do other projects in the world. And the change that happened, the transformation that happened in this area of North Philadelphia is still the same today. In fact, it's grown. The people who lived in that community actually started to teach people in the neighboring streets how to do some of this stuff, and it started to expand. When I went back a few years ago, I got out of the car and I was met by this young man who actually was one of the original kids in that slide that I just showed you, who dug holes, and he had graduated from high school and college, where before most of the kids in the neighborhood, about 50% of the kids wouldn't even graduate from high school. So it was interesting in this sense. What she learned was by having people come together and work on a common project that transformed the physical environment in which they were in, it created the space and the process for them to transform themselves emotionally and spiritually as well, and become a much stronger community. And that community has gone on to, they build actually, they're now in the construction business, so they renovated a lot of the houses that were falling apart and so on. It's an incredible success story, the power of art to transform, the power of doing anything together in a collective and a project. So this is years later, this is along one of the streets. This is Lyon Park. It's another one of the parks. And then in the end, the other thing they did was create a memorial to all the people they had lost in the community. And that was part of kind of bringing together their grieving for, and it's divided by wars or by time periods here. And everyone's name who they lost is actually on one of those totem poles or on one of the walls in the community. So after Philadelphia, I actually headed over to India. And this is a picture of Bombay, of one of the largest slums in Bombay called Dharavi. Anybody here been to Bombay? Back there. So to give you a sense of how big Bombay is and how big the slums are, the official population number of Bombay is around 15 million, but it's estimated to be probably closer to 20 million, and about half the city's population lives in slums. And the reason for that is massive migration into the cities, and you'll see that all over India, actually all over a good portion of the world, not so much this world, not so much the US. And what happens is that the city infrastructure just can't handle the inflow of people. So a lot of this sort of temporary housing is set up and typically built by the people who live there. So the man who I went to see is a man named Jokin Arpatham. Let's see if there's a picture of him. There he is. He's a community organizer in the slums. And Jokin actually was homeless for most of his life. He came from the south of India and came to Bombay as a runaway. Lived on the street for years. I don't think he really had a pair of shoes until probably he was middle-aged. And then he had to get a pair because he was going outside the slum to meet with people. But so at an early age, Jokin lived in the slums. And one of the things he recognized is that there were no services, basic services like trash removal or water or toilets. And so from an early age, he mobilized people in the community to march on the government buildings and demand services like simple trash removal, for example, because the place would just fill up with trash. And he made some headway with the government. But after decades of kind of not making as much headway as he had hoped, he decided that probably the better way to work with government was actually to partner with them or to figure out a way to have a proper dialogue with them. And one of the ways to do that was to mobilize what he had that they didn't have, which was information about who lived in the slums and how many people were there, and what the problems were that could be solved and solutions to those problems, and present that in a plan to government and work with them at coming up with that. So the number one problem that he could see in there was they had no water. No running water, and part of that was because it had grown up so quickly. There was no pipes that came in. It was very hard to build those after the fact once everyone's homes had kind of been built in the slums. But the government was giving them all kinds of reasons why they couldn't run water in there, because the houses were in the way, they couldn't dig below the road. There were cisterns that they had put on some buildings, but it wasn't enough. And this is basic drinking and washing water, right? I mean, this is basic for basic living. You're right in the middle of the city, you don't have it. So he couldn't get any headway on that. There was another issue they had, which was toilets. There were very few toilets in the slum. They had been built by the government at one point, but most of them were broken. They were toilet blocks that were for men and women, so they shared the same public toilets. They were all open, so you can imagine that was exciting. And they were never cared for, so most of them were in disrepair. You couldn't use them. So most people didn't use them. The worst part of it was there was one toilet for every 800 people. So toilets were a huge problem in the slum, and the government knew it because it was a hygiene issue, it was a public health issue. Jochen went to them and said, with the other slum dwellers, counted how many people lived in a block, how many toilets were there, the fact that the toilet didn't work, got all his data together, went to the government and said, we have a solution, which is we will build toilet blocks. If you let us do it, we'll tell you where we think they should be based on the numbers we've provided you, because we know you don't have proper census numbers for these slums. We'll maintain them, we'll design them. They'll be totally our business to look after if you'll fund them. So the government agreed. And in doing that, they were able to build toilet blocks that had women's toilets, men's toilets, children's toilets, and the toilets actually became community centers, like bulletin boards for notices of what was going on, because everybody goes there once a day. So that became a great meeting place in these communities for people. And they took over that responsibility, solved the problem, and actually a big part of the slums have really completely transformed that part. The best part of it is there is a law, and he knew this because he had done his research, that if you put a toilet block in a community, you have to pipe water in. So he got his water, which is spectacular. So he got his water by solving the toilet problem first. One of the things I learned from him, and I think this is where it started to sound familiar to me, like my territory, was he said, you in your middle class ways, don't assume you know what people want. He said, you need to ask people what they want and what they need. Don't assume. Just because you think you know better, you even have a great idea that sounds really nice. He said, let me give you an example. He said there was a not-for-profit that came in and took a look at our slums, which aren't particularly attractive, and said, gosh, we have all these trees. We would love to plant trees in the slum, make it much prettier. And so they came in and planted all these trees, only there was no water. So all the trees died. And Jochen said, if only they had asked, they would have known that what we really needed was water and toilets. There was another group in the slums that I met, and I'll just skim over these guys quickly. The slum dwellers, for the most part, you'll find at all levels of economics in Bombay. Some have cars and TV sets, and some have really very little. But even poorer than the slum dwellers are the pavement dwellers, who are basically homeless. And you'll see them if you ever walk down the streets of Bombay. You'll see when they first come to the city, a lot of them are sleeping on the sidewalk. But as they've been there for a while, they get odd jobs and they make some money, and they buy materials that they can use to build a house. So this is a picture, not a very good one, I might add, but I think I must have been shaking the camera or something, of one of the little huts that was built. Actually, this is probably a finer one than some of the others. But you can see it's made out of corrugated metal. Someone has painted them. And those things that are on the side there are actually beds that they sleep on the road. And so basically, as you started to make more money, you could actually build these little shacks. They're squatters' huts, so they're all along the sidewalk or the sides of railways, and they're illegal. So every once in a while, and more often than not, the police would come in with demolition crews and demolish all the huts. And so the people who lived there lost everything. It would often take them 5 to 6 years to rebuild the little homes that they had. They'd have to take time off work. They couldn't send their kids to school. Their life was totally disrupted, and they were totally set back. And they also never knew when these demolition crews were going to come through, so there was no warning, and they lost all their possessions in this. And one day they discovered that actually it was illegal for demolition crews to come in and demolish their houses, even though they were illegal, unless they were first given notice. Well, if they were given notice, they would have enough time to clear them out and put their possessions somewhere else where they'd be safe. They still would lose their corrugated, metal and some of the housing structure material. But then they found out that actually it was private property. And if it was private property, they could reclaim it. So when the demolition crews came in, they would read the license plate on the trucks that took their stuff away. They'd track the guys down, get their corrugated metal, bring it back, rebuild their hut. And initially, they didn't know they could do any of this. It was a group of women who lived on the pavement who discovered this and came running to Jochen and said, "Did you know we have this right?" And he said, "I didn't know you had that right, but now I do. And I bet there are many more rights that you have that you don't even know you have. So together, this is what I want you to do," he said to them. He said, "I want you to go out and I want you to talk to everybody about when are the demolitions going to come, who's making them, what other rights do you have, how else can you, and as a collective, I want you to come together. I know you don't really know each other very well, but now you've got something in common. Meet together, share your stories, share what you learn, and decide what you're going to do about it." Well, ultimately, long story short, they did. They went around, they talked to each other, they got all sorts of information, they came together and they met, and they called themselves Women Together, or Mahila Milan. This is a picture of some of them. And it took a number of years. You can read about it in more detail. It's very interesting. Eventually, they had someone write letters for them to the government. Then they had an audience with government. Then eventually, they went to the government and said, "We're homeless. We know you want us off the street, so we have a solution for you. Find us some land. We're saving money to build houses. We'll build houses on that land. We'll move off the street. We got to work together. If you want us out of there, we're willing to work with you." Long story short, it happened. In 2014, 80 homeless families moved off the street. Many more followed. In that same year, Jochen was actually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was always behind them, always their cheerleader, kind of always setting the parameters for them. They were so successful at this that they actually ended up traveling all over India and teaching other women how to do this in cities. And then Jochen formed something called Slum Dwellers International, which was an organization of slum dwellers all over the world that shared what they learned, how they worked with cities. And the women would also travel to different parts of the world to meet different women's groups in slums and talk about how they had succeeded in Bombay, what they had learned, and they'd share their learning. Very quick way of telling you a lot, but give you some sense of how important a couple things are. One is, do ask people what they want, don't assume, right? That's a marketing thing, right? Your customer, don't assume you know what your customer wants, right? I was like, oh my gosh, it totally makes sense. The other thing is the importance of community. None of these people could have done any of this on their own. They had to do it together collectively. They were much stronger as a group than they were as individuals. And they didn't even know they were a community until they found this common issue that they all wanted to solve. And the other thing I think that's also really important is to establish connections and alliances. Well, we do that in business anyways, but it's really important in solving their problem, which was who outside of our community can help us accomplish what we want to accomplish. The next guy that I went to see is a heart surgeon in Bangalore. He was Mother Teresa's doctor before she died in Calcutta. And he was a cardiothoracic surgeon, mainly in pediatrics, dealing with children. He had a very successful career in the UK and was called back to India by someone he knew to work in Calcutta. That's where he met Mother Teresa. And while he was operating on a child, she saw him tending to a child he was caring for and said, "God gave you a gift with children, and that's what you should spend your life, you should devote your life to, or that's what you need to spend your life working on." He left Calcutta before she died and moved back to Bangalore, where his father-in-law lived, and set up a hospital there called Narayana Health. There's an Indian name, but it was just Narayana Health. Now it's called Narayana Health. And it started off as a heart hospital. He hired some of the best surgeons in India. They produced 5 times as many. They conducted 5 times as many surgeries as most American hospitals would do. The first-class healthcare, people from all over the world came to get their hearts operated on by this hospital. And with the proceeds he made from those operations, he funded the surgery for poor children, first in India and then all over the world. And so he built this hospital, and it's now gone on to be a nephrology and all kinds of other disciplines where other doctors have come in and joined, where basically they offer the top-notch service in tertiary care, so like heart surgery, cancer, nephrology, and so on, and charge people who can afford it, and then with the proceeds that they make, they fund people who can't. Now, how do they do that? Like a good business. They operate at maximum capacity, so they have 1,000 beds that are always full. They perform, as I said, 5 times as many operations there as they do in most American hospitals. To give you a sense, the cost per surgery for open heart surgery is $2,500 versus $20,000 here in the US. No, all the doctors are working as doctors, not as administrators. And I sat in on a business meeting with him, and he counts every darn syringe that comes into that hospital and every rubber glove, and where does it go and how does it get spent. The attention to cost control is incredible, and he's a surgeon. And everybody in that hospital manages cost like you would in a great business, because he believes that the money we make, the money we get in to do what we do is paid for by a mother with a sick child. And so therefore, every cost we put against that has to be justified. And he says that's actually one of the hardest things to do as he gets bigger, is to manage those costs and to keep them in line, like any good business. The other thing that he does, which I find so interesting, is in spite of how busy he is and the huge hospital kind of conglomerate that he runs, he still sees patients every day. And he says, if I don't do that, if you in healthcare as a doctor, you stop being a doctor and you stop seeing patients, you stop understanding what it is they need, and you stop innovating. It's like, oh, these are all things I learned in school. And finally, a big issue here is distribution. A big issue with healthcare, as he'll tell you, is we have the capacity to save people's lives. We just don't have the capacity to get to them. Particularly in a place like India, where most of the population lives in rural areas, he's created mobile cardiac units that go out in buses to actually monitor people and to treat people before heart disease becomes a big issue. And so they go out and drive through the countryside with a whole school bus full of doctors, essentially. And the other thing he's done is partnered with the Indian Aerospace. He's done a number of things, but I'll just pick these to tell you about Indian Aerospace to create telemedicine. So when I was there, I would sit in with him with talking to patients who were on the other side of the country. And he'd do consultations, and he'd look at their charts, and he'd look at their x-rays, and then he'd consult with them. Because they couldn't afford to fly all the way to Bangalore to see him, but they could still get care from him. They've also performed operations with people piping in from Philadelphia, experts on anesthesiology that they don't have in their hospital that are counseling their people in the hospital in Bangalore. So one of the things that's really interesting about what he's doing is because he has such huge volume going through his hospitals, every high-tech company that's in the equipment business in healthcare wants him to try their products. So he's got all the state-of-the-art equipment in his hospital, too. So, very inspiring guy. And finally, okay, then we're done. I came back to San Francisco to meet a woman that she was probably the first person I met many, many years ago that was kind of doing the dig where you are thing. And this is actually a picture of Delancey Street. Has anybody ever heard of Delancey Street in San Francisco? One person. Okay. So Delancey Street is a residential learning center. Actually, what it really is a place where convicted criminals go and not serve time, but rehabilitate each other. So at any one time, up to 500 people can live in here. The people who live in here are, for the most part, convicted criminals with, on average, 18 felony convictions. Most of them have been in prison 3 to 5 times, maybe more. And they now live in this place called Delancey Street, which is right on the Embarcadero. So it's really kind of a high rent district, actually, where they are now. It wasn't when they first built it. And they're charged with rehabilitating each other. There are no prison guards. There are no social workers. The only person that is not a criminal or a drug addict is this woman here, Mimi Silbert, who's pointing her finger. And she's actually inside a restaurant that they run called Delancey Street Restaurant, which if you're ever in San Francisco, I highly recommend you go there because the price is right and the food is really good. But so how does this work? When you're convicted of a crime and you are waiting sentencing and you're sitting in jail, you will have heard of Delancey Street, and it's an option for some of you to go there. But you have to write a letter or put your hand up and say, hey, I want to be considered for this place. And then you go through an interview process, and you're interviewed by the residents. The residents are also convicted criminals, and they decide whether they want to accept you in. And then if you're accepted in, you arrive on the first day, and you are put in a room with 8 other people, 8 other guys, mostly men that are at this. I think it's about 70 to 80% male. you are put in a room with 8 other guys, and you're taught from the ground, you're stripped of everything, and you're taught from the very beginning how to wash the floor, how to wash the toilets, how to make your bed. And if you don't do it well, you have to do it again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And once you do it well, you teach another guy how to do it. And then when you do that, and then you move on to setting the table in the dining room. And then you move on to, and once you get good at that, you teach someone else how to set the table properly. And once you get good at that, you move on to bussing the table. And once you're done with that, you move on to cooking bread, and then so on and so on and so forth. To the point where you actually end up in levels where you're actually running the finances for this place, or maybe running one of the businesses that they run. And Mimi Silbert, who founded this back in the 70s, believes that you only get better by helping somebody else. And that each one here, her motto is each one teach one. The way that you become a better person is by learning and then by teaching someone else what you learn, doing something for somebody else. There's a lot more that happens in there too. There's only 2 rules. If you break one, you're kicked out. No drugs, no violence. The interesting thing is that the door is locked to get in, the gate, but that's so that people won't come in, because everyone's always curious about this place. It looks kind of cool. You want to go in, but you can leave anytime. So when you are chosen for Delancey Street, the minimum time you have to stay there is 2 years. Most people will stay 4 to 8 years. And you leave when the community decides you're ready to leave. So you go in front of a list of peers. They talk about, do they feel you're ready to go out into the world? And everyone who's in there will get a GED or some version of high school graduation. Many of them go on and get higher degrees. A lot of them come out being accountants while they're in there. So most of the people come out of Delancey Street, go back into society. There's a 10% recidivism rate for people who've left here. And about 18,000 people have gone through Delancey Street. There are a number of other smaller Delancey Streets around the country that they've set up. And for the last 3 years, they've actually been inside Folsom Prison. So they've set up a Delancey Street in there as well. That's not in the book because it came out before that happened. These are some of the other thing that's so interesting about these guys, and of course, as a business person, I was really interested in this. They take no public funding. Everything they do is self-sustaining. And this is actually a feature of all the people in the book. In one way or another, they are self-sustaining. And one of the guys who I don't talk about today is a man in Thailand said, what we do is too important to depend on the funding of donors or even government. So we have to actually be self-sustaining to make sure that our work continues. So a number of them run businesses associated with what they're doing, and those businesses are actually part of the model that actually makes it work. In the case of Delancey Street, they run the largest moving company in Northern California called Delancey Street Movers. They also run the largest Christmas tree business in San Francisco. So if you ever live in San Francisco, buy a Christmas tree. You're going to be chatting up a resident from Delancey Street when you're buying your tree. They run a restaurant, Delancey Street Restaurant. They run a livery service. They run dog grooming. They have a bookstore. They have an upholstery business. I mean, basically any business you can possibly imagine these guys are in. The proceeds from that go into a pool that pays all the bills for the residents, pays everyone's food, and so on. It's kind of like communal living from the 1960s. Incredibly successful model. I think because it understands the importance of empowerment of community, which really this is a very strong community. The importance in that community that everyone is successful. It's something Mimi drives home to them. If you don't behave, the game's over for all of us. So there's always that hanging over their heads as well. So actually, in the end, I'm going to kind of quickly summarize this. The things that I thought made these guys successful, weren't have a vision, because in fact, none of them did. They absolutely, each one of them fell into what they did. They just one day saw an opportunity to make a difference, given what they knew how to do, and then they took the first step, and it became this big thing that you see today, but it really started as something very small, which I think is very encouraging, which really means any of us can start something. It doesn't have to be as big as what they're doing, but it's small. But the main things they all had in common were whatever they did, they created an environment that felt safe for risks to be taken, for chances to be taken, to try new things, to move forward. Heal before you rebuild was something that Lily said. She, I think, exemplifies it the most, but you'll see that through all the stories. Ask people what they need. What do people want, right? Don't assume you know. Build a sense of community, build a community, because no one can do things alone. Cultivate connections and alliances outside of what you do, because you'll need a lot of help in getting things done. Teach what you learn and create a narrative. Very hard to measure the results of these efforts, quantitatively. So the narrative actually helps you do that. It's okay, what was successful, what wasn't? Okay, what are we going to adjust? What are we going to change? What are we going to do more of? Very important. Teach what you learn, or I said that, teach what you learn. Incorporate self-sustainability into the solution, my favorite part, right? They're all self-sustaining. And one step at a time, all the time. You're never going to find the solution to the problem because the situation's always changing. And so one of the things they taught me is process is really important, that a process that is flexible, that's customer-oriented, that changes as the situation changes, and a sense of community or a group that trusts each other, that feels safe, that can actually move with those changes is what makes this possible. So finally, what does dig where you are mean? It was actually something that a teacher said to me in Sweden one day, and I think this is really an important message for all of us, which is sometimes we feel a little overwhelmed by all the possible things that could be done out there, but where you can make the biggest difference is just by looking right in front of you and finding a way to take what you know how to do and just help one person. And frankly, that's a good thing. If it's helping another person, it's a good thing. Taking what you know how to do. So take those business degrees of yours and go out, work for a company, but when you get the call to do something that maybe doesn't have to do with business, it's that way of thinking that's actually going to help you solve all kinds of problems that you're going to encounter in the world. And one of those is actually going to speak to your gut and take what you learn here and go use it. Because I think it's the best education I got. It certainly helped me. And I saw it applied here. These guys didn't even know what they were applying. One of them did, Debbie Shetty did, but they did. And I think part of the reason they were successful is because of some of those things you're learning in class now. So that's it. Okay, yeah, and I'll answer questions. You can ask anything you want. It was a time in the world where I think a lot was changing. So it was the time of the subprime mortgage. And I was interested, I think I was a little discouraged that the large organizations that I had kind of expected to look after things. I mean, I'm not that naive, but I sort of expected it. They weren't really doing the job that we expected them to do. And I had been part of some of those large organizations. And so here was an example of people who weren't large organizations, who were frankly, they weren't titled, right? They didn't have advanced degrees, and they were incredible what they were accomplishing. And so I didn't feel there was any choice but to actually go try to figure out what was it that they were doing that could be an alternative way forward from the one we were in. And actually that is some of the stuff that I deal with in the book too, which is understanding the role that large organizations do play as we look at the future, and the role of small grassroots or individuals, particularly ones that live in a democracy like this. We have the potential to do it. I think to a great extent, we've abdicated that responsibility to large organizations because they do it well. We're a wealthier society. We can afford these organizations. But in the process, I think we've lost a lot of confidence in ourselves to be able to do things like these people have done. I think a lot of that, too, is the media putting heroes up on the board for us. And I don't know about you, but I look at that and go, I could never be that person. So there was a lot of that going on, I think, in my head at the time. And so personally, I actually really wanted to understand it. And I think also I wanted to know what would it feel like to be one of these people that seems so purpose-driven as opposed to career-driven, right? And for years, I lived the life, and I had the whatever. Like a lot of us, we leave school, and that's what we think we should do. But here were some people that had been tremendously successful, and it didn't seem that they had followed that. And I was curious about that. I think you start with yourself. And I think once you yourself knows what it feels like, it's when you figure out this is what you're supposed to do, I think I said this to some of you may have heard this, it's entirely unremarkable. You're sort of like, that's it? That's what I'm, So, because we have this feeling like we should be great, we should be doing these really great things, but it is really simply starting with yourself and what you know how to do. And I am glad I had that business degree, but also there were other things about myself. Starting with what you know how to do and taking that out and having the confidence to try that and not worrying about whether it's going to be good or not. Not worry about whether you're going to be a good person or not. Boy, tell me about the pressure for that, right? If you're helping another person by doing what you know how to do, it's good. And you just never know where it's going to lead you. So the other thing I learned from them too is don't have a plan in your head. So if someone asked me in one of the classes, and I don't know if they're here, how's your life changed after doing this? I said, it's completely changed. That past I had, I've moved on. Now I listen to what people ask of me. So I'm here in Arkansas because Christy called me. And she said, you want to come to Arkansas? I said, I've never been to Arkansas, but you asked me, so I'll say yes, I'll come and I'll meet all of you. And I think that's actually a very important part of this too, is how does the world need you? That will often actually set your direction. It did for them. Yeah, you say yes to it. So, yeah.